What if everything critics told you was wrong? What if the movies they dismissed as garbage were the ones audiences quietly kept alive for decades? Tonight we are stepping into a world where failure became legacy, where bad reviews could not stop cultural impact. 12 comedies from the 1980s that critics rejected but people refused to forget. And the deeper you go, the more surprising the truth becomes. Number 12, UHF, 1989. It arrived like a signal no one asked for, loud, chaotic, completely unfiltered. And when UHF hit theaters, it confused critics so badly they dismissed it almost instantly. Reviews called it childish, messy, directionless, a film that felt like channel surfing without purpose. But here is what those critics missed. This was not a conventional comedy. It was a weaponized parody machine built by Weird Al Yankovic at the peak of his creative absurdity. The film follows a struggling TV station that suddenly explodes into bizarre programming. Every scene becomes a sketch. Every moment breaks structure. Game shows spiral into chaos. Commercials turn into surreal nightmares. Nothing obeys logic. That lack of structure is exactly why critics rejected it. They expected narrative discipline. Instead, they got comedic anarchy. The tone shifts violently from satire to slapstick to outright nonsense. At the time, this felt like failure. Today, it feels ahead of its time. Modern meme culture, internet humor, rapid-fire absurdity, all of it echoes what this film was doing decades earlier. And then there is the deeper layer. Behind the madness, it's a story about creative freedom versus corporate control. A small station fighting bland mainstream television, a celebration of weird voices breaking through polished systems. It was not just comedy, it was rebellion disguised as stupidity. Audiences slowly caught on. Over time, UHF became a cult classic. Fans memorized its sketches, quoted its lines, celebrated its refusal to behave like a normal film. What critics called garbage turned into something strangely prophetic, because sometimes the joke is not supposed to make sense. Sometimes the joke is that nothing makes sense at all. Number 11, Ernest Goes to Camp, 1987. There are films critics dislike, then there are films they outright reject. Ernest Goes to Camp landed firmly in the second category. Reviews labeled it childish, simplistic, even embarrassing. A comedy built entirely around one character doing the same joke again and again. And yet that is exactly why it worked. Jim Varney created Ernest as a character who exists outside logic. He is not just clumsy, he is chaos in human form. A man who approaches every situation with confidence and completely destroys it within seconds. The film places him in a summer camp setting and lets everything spiral from there. Critics saw repetition, audiences saw comfort. Because Ernest was never about clever writing, he was about energy, physical comedy, exaggerated reactions, a throwback to earlier eras of slapstick, where personality mattered more than plot. In a decade filled with polished studio comedies, Ernest felt almost primitive. That primitive quality became its strength. The film also carries an unexpected emotional core. Beneath the chaos is a story about protecting something innocent. Struggling camp, a group of kids who have nowhere else to go. Ernest becomes their unlikely defender, not through intelligence, but through sheer persistence and heart. Critics ignored that layer completely. They focused on the surface, the silliness, the lack of sophistication, but audiences connected with something deeper. A character who fails constantly, yet never gives up. A comedy that refuses to be cynical. Over time, Ernest became more than a joke. He became a symbol of a different kind of humor, one that does not care about approval, one that survives purely because people enjoy it, and sometimes that is enough to outlast every bad review ever written. Number 10, The Toxic Avenger, 1984. There are bad movies, and then there are movies critics believe should not exist at all. The Toxic Avenger was treated like the second kind. Reviewers called it disgusting, irresponsible, completely without artistic value, a film soaked in grime and chaos that seemed designed to offend rather than entertain. But that reaction is exactly the point. Created by Trauma Entertainment, this was never meant to fit inside mainstream expectations. It tells the story of a weak janitor who is transformed into a grotesque superhero after a toxic act. What follows is a strange collision of horror, comedy, and social satire. Critics only saw the surface. They saw violence pushed to absurd levels, grotesque makeup effects, scenes that felt intentionally tasteless, but underneath that exaggerated ugliness sits something far more deliberate. A parody of the superhero genre long before it became self-aware. a story about outsiders gaining power in a world that ignores them. The film's tone refuses to settle. One moment it is cartoonishly violent, the next it is strangely sincere, then it swings back into outrageous humor. That instability made critics uncomfortable. They wanted structure, consistency, something they could categorize. This film refuses categorization, and that refusal is what allowed it to survive. Over time, audiences discovered it not as a traditional movie, but as an experience, midnight screenings, cult communities, fans celebrating its refusal to follow rules. What was once dismissed as trash slowly became a badge of honor, because sometimes the most offensive thing a film can do is not fail. It is refused to behave. YDD, number 9, Revenge of the Nerds, 1984. Some comedies age poorly, others were controversial the moment they arrived. Revenge of the Nerds belongs to the second category. Critics did not just dislike it, they questioned its morality, its tone, its entire approach to humor, and yet audiences embraced it immediately. On the surface, this is a simple underdog story, social outcasts pushed aside by stronger, more popular rivals. But the film twists that formula into something far more chaotic. The nerds do not just fight back, they humiliate, manipulate, and disrupt the system in ways that feel almost anarchic. Critics found this deeply uncomfortable. They expected a clean victory narrative. Instead, they got something messy, a comedy that celebrates rebellion without always questioning the consequences. Scenes that blur the line between humor and discomfort. Moments that even at the time felt controversial. But here is the key. The film tapped into something real. For audiences who felt overlooked or underestimated, this was not just comedy. It was wish fulfillment, a fantasy where intelligence and persistence could overturn social hierarchies, where the people at the bottom suddenly gained control. That emotional connection overpowered critical backlash. The film became a cultural phenomenon. Quotes spread everywhere. Characters became icons. Entire generations identified with its central idea, even if they ignored its rough edges. Over time, the conversation changed. Modern audiences re-examine it, question it, debate it, but they still watch it, still remember it, still talk about it. And that is something most critically praised films never achieve, because controversy does not kill a movie. Sometimes it keeps it alive longer than praise ever could. Number 8, Bachelor Party, 1984. Before he became one of the most respected actors in Hollywood, Tom Hanks was at the center of a comedy critics could not stand. Bachelor Party was labeled crude, tasteless, desperate, a film accused of chasing shock value instead of real humor, and yet audiences showed up anyway. The premise sounds simple. A wild night before marriage spirals into chaos, but the execution pushes everything to extremes. Every situation escalates, every joke aims to go further than expected. The film does not pause to reflect. It moves forward like a runaway train powered by reckless energy. Critics saw a lack of restraint. They expected balance. They wanted emotional grounding. Instead, they were given a nonstop barrage of outrageous scenarios, parties that feel out of control, characters behaving without consequence, humor that refuses to apologize. But that refusal became the film's identity. At its core, this is not just a party comedy, it is a snapshot of a very specific era, a time when studios were willing to take risks on bold, unapologetic humor, a time before formulas became safe and predictable. The film captures that chaotic spirit without trying to refine it. And then there is Tom Hanks. Even in the middle of all the madness, his performance anchors the film. He brings charm to situations that could easily collapse into noise. He gives the audience someone to follow through the chaos. That presence quietly elevates everything around him. Over time, the criticism faded. What remained was a film people returned to for its energy, its unpredictability, its refusal to behave like a polite comedy. It may not be refined, it may not be subtle, but it is undeniably alive. And sometimes that is exactly what audiences are looking for. Number 7, Police Academy, 1984. When Police Academy was released, critics dismissed it almost immediately. Reviews called it lazy, juvenile, built on the lowest level of humor imaginable. A film that seemed designed to entertain without ever challenging the audience. But audiences did not want to be challenged. They wanted to laugh. The film presents a concept, a police force forced to accept anyone who applies. What follows is a collection of misfits who turn discipline chaos. Each character brings a different form of absurdity, exaggerated personality, ridiculous skills, behavior that constantly breaks the rules. Critics saw repetition. They saw a series of jokes stitched together without depth. But what they missed was the film's rhythm. It understands exactly what it is. It builds momentum through character interactions. It allows each personality to shine without overcomplicating the story, and that simplicity became its greatest strength. The film does not pretend to be important, it does not aim for sophistication, it focuses entirely on delivering consistent humor, scene after scene, designed to keep the audience engaged without slowing down. That approach worked. The movie became a massive success, not just a hit, but the beginning of an entire franchise. Characters became recognizable worldwide, lines became part of everyday conversation. What critics dismissed as disposable proved to have lasting appeal, because sometimes a film succeeds not by being complex, but by understanding exactly what its audience wants and delivering it without hesitation. Number 6, Weird Science, 1985. When Weird Science arrived, it left critics confused more than impressed. Reviews described it as immature, unfocused, built on a concept that felt more like a gimmick than a story. A teenage fantasy pushed so far into absurdity that it seemed impossible to take seriously. But that absurdity is exactly where its power lives. Directed by John Hughes, this film steps away from his usual, grounded coming-of-age stories and dives into something far stranger. Two socially awkward teenagers create the perfect woman using a computer. What follows is not romance. It is chaos disguised as wish fulfillment. PD critics expected emotional depth. They expected something similar to Hughes's earlier work. Instead, they got a surreal ride that bends reality whenever it feels like it. Scenes shift from awkward high school moments to full-blown fantasy without warning. Characters learn lessons through bizarre situations rather than traditional growth. That unpredictability became the dividing line. For critics, it felt inconsistent. For audiences, it felt exciting. The film does not follow rules because it is not trying to reflect reality. It is exploring insecurity through exaggeration. Every ridiculous moment represents a deeper fear. Rejection, embarrassment, the desire to be accepted. And then there is Lisa, not just a fantasy creation, but a force that challenges the boys to grow. She pushes them into uncomfortable situations, forces them to confront their own limitations. The comedy may be loud, but the transformation is real. Over time, the film found its audience. What once seemed shallow revealed layers of meaning, a strange mix of fantasy and emotional truth, a reminder that sometimes growth comes from the most unexpected experiences. Because beneath all the absurdity, there is something honest, a story about confidence, identity, and the awkward path toward becoming someone stronger. Number 5, Stripes, 1981. Critics expected discipline, they expected structure. Instead, Stripes delivered chaos inside a military uniform. Reviews described it as uneven, loosely constructed, a film that felt like it was making things up as it went along, and in many ways it was. Starring Bill Murray and Harold Ramis, the film follows two directionless men who join the army with no real plan. What unfolds is not a traditional military story, it is a rebellion against structure itself. Authority becomes the joke, discipline becomes optional. Critics struggled with its tone. The film begins as a grounded comedy about failure and reinvention, then it gradually shifts into something far more. Training sequences blur into improvisation. Dialogue feels spontaneous. Entire scenes seem driven by the energy of the performers rather than a strict script. That looseness frustrated reviewers. They saw a lack of control, a film that refused to stay focused, but audiences experience something completely different. A sense of freedom, comedy that feels alive because it is not restricted by rigid storytelling. And at the center of it all is Bill Murray. His performance does not follow rules. He delivers lines with unpredictability, timing that feels natural rather than rehearsed. He turns ordinary moments into something memorable simply by being present within them. That presence carries the film. Over time, Stripes became more than a comedy. It became a reflection of a generation pushing back against expectations, a story about finding purpose in the least expected place, not through discipline, but through individuality, because sometimes the best way to fit into a system is to completely ignore how it is supposed to work. Number 4, Overboard, 1987. When Overboard first reached audiences, it was met with confusion more than admiration. Critics questioned its premise. They called it implausible, morally questionable, even uncomfortable. Much a story built on deception that seemed impossible to accept as lighthearted entertainment, but audiences saw something different. The center of the film are Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell, whose chemistry transforms the entire experience. The narrative follows a wealthy woman who loses her memory and is convinced by a struggling man that she is his wife. On paper, it feels manipulative, even cruel. But the execution introduces something unexpected: warmth. The film slowly shifts from deception to transformation. What begins as a selfish act evolves into a strange kind of emotional connection. The character at the center does not remain a victim of the situation. She grows within it, learns resilience, discovers empathy in a world she never understood before. Critics focused on the premise. They saw the setup as flawed and could not move past it, but audiences responded to the emotional arc, the gradual change, the way humor and sincerity begin to blend as the story unfolds. It becomes less about the deception and more about what happens after it. And that is where the film finds its identity. It is not a perfect story. It is not even a comfortable one at times, but it carries a charm that refuses to disappear. Like the performances ground the absurdity. The emotional beats give meaning to situations that could easily feel empty. Over time, the narrative shifted. What was once criticized became reevaluated through a different lens. A film remembered not for its flaws, but for its heart, for the unlikely bond that forms at its center, for the way it balances humor with genuine emotion. Why? Because sometimes a story does not need to be perfect. It just needs to make people feel something real. Number 3, Summer School, 1987. Some films are dismissed quietly. Others are written off as forgettable the moment they appear. Summer School fell into that second category. Critics labeled it predictable, lightweight, a formula comedy that offered nothing new. But that simplicity became its advantage. The film follows a laid-back gym teacher forced to teach a group of misfit students during summer break. There is no high-concept twist, no dramatic stakes, just a collection of personalities learning to function together. Critics expected more complexity, more ambition, something that would elevate the material. Instead, they got something deliberately restrained. The film does not chase spectacle. It focuses on character interaction, small moments, subtle shifts in relationships. Humor emerges from behavior rather than exaggerated scenarios. Each student represents a different kind of struggle: distraction, insecurity, lack of direction. And at the center is a teacher who does not fit the traditional mold. He is not strict, not authoritative. He connects with the students by understanding them rather than controlling them. That dynamic creates a tone that feels relaxed yet meaningful. Growth happens quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Critics overlooked that approach. They saw familiarity instead of intention. They dismissed the film for not breaking new ground, but audiences connected with its honesty. The idea that progress does not always come through pressure. Sometimes it comes through patience, through someone believing in you when no one else does. Over time, the film gained recognition, not as a groundbreaking comedy, but as a comforting one. A story that feels genuine without trying to impress. A reminder that not every film needs to be loud to be effective, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with people the longest. Number 2, Porky's, 1981. Few comedies of the decade were attacked as aggressively as Porky's. Critics did not just dislike it, they condemned it. Reviews described it as crude, offensive, built entirely on shock value with no artistic merit, a film that represented everything they believed was wrong with modern comedy, and yet audiences turned it into a phenomenon. Set in the 1950s, this story follows a group of teenagers navigating friendship, insecurity, and desire. But instead of presenting these themes with subtlety, the film exaggerates everything. Situations escalate quickly, jokes push boundaries, moments that would normally be restrained are amplified until they become impossible to ignore. Critics focused on the surface. They saw vulgarity and stopped there. But beneath that layer sits something more structured, a classic coming-of-age story wrapped in exaggerated humor. The characters are not just chasing laughs, they are searching for identity, trying to understand themselves in a world that feels confusing and restrictive. The humor becomes a release, a way of confronting awkward realities through exaggeration. Every outrageous moment reflects a genuine insecurity. Every extreme situation highlights the uncertainty of growing up. It may not be refined, but it is rooted in something honest. That honesty connected with audiences. The film became one of the highest grossing comedies of its time. Not because it impressed critics, but because it resonated with viewers who recognized its emotional core beneath the chaos. They saw themselves in the characters even when the situations felt exaggerated. Over time, the conversation evolved. The film remains controversial, debated, re-examined through different perspectives. But it has never been forgotten. It continues to exist in that space between rejection and admiration. Because sometimes the films that provoke the strongest reactions are the ones that refuse to disappear. Number 1, The Garbage Pail Kids Movie, 1987. There are films critics dislike, there are films critics hate, and then there are films critics treat as if they should never have been made. The Garbage Pail Kids Movie exists at that extreme edge. Reviews called it repulsive, incoherent, an assault on taste itself, a film that seemed to abandon every standard of storytelling, and yet it found an audience that never let it go. Based on the controversial trading cards, the film brings grotesque characters to life, mutated children with exaggerated features and bizarre personalities. The world they inhabit feels distorted, almost surreal. Nothing is clean. Nothing is polished. Everything leans into discomfort. Critics saw this as failure. They expected structure, clarity, something that could be understood within traditional storytelling rules. Instead, they were confronted with something chaotic and unpredictable. A film that feels like it exists outside conventional cinema, but that is exactly why it endured. It captured a specific kind of rebellious imagination, a refusal to conform to expectations of beauty or order. It embraces the strange, the unpleasant, the absurd. In doing so, it creates a world that feels completely unique. For younger audiences at the time, it felt different, not safe, not controlled, but oddly fascinating. A film that did not talk down to them. It presented something raw, something that felt like it was not designed for approval. That sense of danger became part of its appeal. Over time, it transformed. What was once considered unwatchable became a cult curiosity. People returned to it not because it was perfect, but because it was unforgettable. Its flaws became part of its identity. Its rejection became part of its story. Awkward because sometimes the films that are pushed away the hardest are the ones that leave the deepest mark. So next time someone calls a movie garbage, take a second look. Because history has a strange way of rewriting judgment. Some films fade away while others survive against every expectation. If you enjoyed this countdown, like and subscribe and tell me which forgotten comedy you still love the most.